how could a single woman, a widow standing in supplication beneath the broad branches of an ancient oak tree, manage to so completely captivate a victorious king that she not only won his heart, but fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of English history? This pivotal moment, steeped in folklore, represents the intersection of personal desire and political destiny, a single encounter that would set in motion decades of conflict, forge a new dynasty, and redefine the very concept of royal power in a war-torn kingdom. This figure was Elizabeth Woodville, a woman whose status defies simple categorization. While often labeled a commoner by her detractors to emphasize the shocking nature of her rise, she was, in fact, descended from minor, albeit respectable, nobility through her mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg. More pressingly, she was a woman in a precarious position, the grieving widow of a Lancastrian knight, Sir John Grey of Groby, who had fallen in the brutal factional violence of the Wars of the Roses, leaving her and her two young sons dispossessed and at the mercy of the new regime. The year was 1464, and the prevailing legend, a story perhaps too romantic to be entirely factual, yet too persistent to ignore, dictates that Elizabeth strategically positioned herself along with her two sons under the famed Queen's Oak in Whittleberry Forest. Her purpose was not one of romance, but of survival. She intended to intercept the New Yorkist king, the formidable Edward IV, during his hunt. Her plea was a desperate yet dignified petition for the restoration of her late husband's confiscated lands, the rightful inheritance of her sons. King Edward IV, then at the height of his power and famed for his charm, martial prowess, and insatiable appetite for beautiful women, was immediately and profoundly captivated. He had expected supplication, perhaps tears. He was met instead with a mesmerizing beauty and an iron will. He made his intentions clear, offering her a place as his paramour, a position of comfort and influence. But Elizabeth Woodville, in an act of staggering audacity and self-worth, famously refused to become another royal mistress. Her reply, whether spoken or implied, was clear. She would yield to him only as his wife and queen. This sets the stage for a seismic political upheaval. What are the consequences when a monarch, ruling a kingdom still raw from civil war, chooses to marry not for diplomatic alliance or political consolidation, but for personal passion, or, as his critics would claim, pure lust? In marrying a subject, a widow from the wrong side of the conflict, Edward IV was purposefully defying the wisdom of his entire Privy Council, most notably his powerful mentor, the Earl of Warwick, and in doing so, he was gambling the stability of his throne and risking the outbreak of a new, perhaps even more bitter civil war. The die was cast on May 1st, 1464. In an act that was both incredibly romantic and politically explosive, King Edward IV married Elizabeth Woodville. The ceremony was not a grand state affair, but one conducted in absolute secrecy, held clandestinely within the modest chapel of her family's manor at Grafton Regis. This was not just a private wedding. It was a calculated concealment of an act that the king knew would be seen as a betrayal by his closest allies. The scale of the secrecy was profound. The only witnesses to this binding union were Elizabeth's formidable mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, who herself had made a controversial second marriage, and perhaps two attendant ladies. For a king, this was an unprecedented and catastrophic political misstep. The marriage of a monarch was a cornerstone of international diplomacy, a tool used to forge powerful alliances like the one Warwick was currently negotiating in France and secure borders. Edward had just thrown away his single greatest bargaining chip for a woman his court considered beneath him. The news was kept secret for months, a ticking bomb at the heart of the court. When the king's most powerful advisor, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known as the kingmaker, for his role in placing Edward on the throne, finally learned the truth, his reaction was predictably volcanic. He had been in the midst of negotiating a prestigious marriage for Edward with a French princess. The revelation that his efforts were a sham, that his king had married a commoner behind his back, left him publicly and utterly humiliated, his credibility shattered. This humiliation curdled into a cold, dangerous rage. Despite the political firestorm, the fact was irreversible. The commoner was now the anointed Queen of England. Elizabeth, understanding the precariousness of her position and the animosity of the established nobility, knew she could not rely on traditional structures for support. How, then, was she to secure her power and ensure the longevity of her reign? Her strategy was immediate and decisive. She would bypass the old guard entirely by elevating her own extensive family, the Woodvilles, making them the new, powerful, and utterly loyal center of the court's universe. To solidify her disputed status, Elizabeth was formally crowned queen at Westminster Abbey in May 1465, a year after her secret wedding. This was no quiet affair. Edward, understanding the need for a show of force, orchestrated a lavish and magnificent spectacle. The coronation's opulence served a clear political purpose. It was a public relations masterpiece designed to dazzle the populace and, more importantly, to compel the reluctant, resentful nobility to publicly bend the knee and accept their new low-born queen. The moment the crown touched her head, the Woodville family's meteoric ascent began. This wasn't a subtle integration into the nobility, it was a deluge. The Woodvilles were not a small, retiring family. They were ambitious, politically savvy. Numerous Elizabeth had 12 siblings and possessed a voracious, unapologetic hunger for the power, titles, and wealth that had suddenly become available to them through their royal connection. The Great Woodville Marriage Market, as it became known, was put into immediate effect. Her father, Richard Woodville, was elevated from a mere baron to the prestigious position of Earl Rivers and appointed Lord High Treasurer. More significantly, her 5 brothers and 7 sisters were all systematically and strategically married off, not to minor gentry, but into the absolute richest and most powerful noble houses in England, often securing matches that the established aristocracy had coveted for their own children. This rapid colonization of the nobility raises a critical question that defines Elizabeth's reign. Was this massive, tightly knit family network her greatest strength? A loyal bulwark against her enemies, or was it, in fact, her fatal weakness? Did their loyalty provide her with a secure foundation, or did their collective ambition and the resentment they inspired ultimately create the very instability that would lead to her downfall? The core of the Woodville problem, as perceived by the old aristocracy, was their perceived and often blatant greed. The most scandalous example, which sent shockwaves of distaste through the court, was the marriage of her brother, John Woodville. At the age of 20, he was wed to the incredibly wealthy Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Catherine Neville, a woman who was nearly 70 years old. This was not a match of affection. It was a naked, shameless, and, to many, grotesque acquisition of vast wealth and estates. While some siblings provided scandal, others amassed real, tangible power. Her brother, the cultured and chivalrous Anthony Woodville, Lord Rivers, ascended to become one of the most influential men at court. He was granted stewardship over the education and household of the young heir to the throne, the Prince of Wales, a position that gave him immense control over the future king and, by extension, the future of the kingdom. This rapid creation of a powerful, loyalist network, comprised of what the established families viewed as new money upstarts, was dangerously effective. It did not, however, exist in a vacuum. It succeeded only by displacing others. This maneuvering created a deep well of resentment and powerful enemies, most significantly among the old nobility, families like the Nevilles, led by the slighted Earl of Warwick. They didn't just feel ignored, they felt with mounting fury that they were being actively and systematically replaced. This simmering resentment finally boiled over in the mind of the kingmaker. It led to a question of profound treason. How do you justify betraying the very king whom you, almost single-handedly, fought to put on the throne? For Warwick, the answer lay in the belief that the king he had created had become a puppet, pulling the strings for a grasping, low-born family, and that the real England was being corrupted. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, was no longer just resentful. He was consumed by fury. The secret Woodville marriage was the ultimate insult, a personal humiliation that had completely ruined his carefully laid diplomatic plans for a powerful French alliance. His influence was gone, his advice ignored. If the current king would not listen to reason, Warwick decided, in a breathtaking act of political arrogance, that he would simply get a new one. To achieve this, Warwick forged an unlikely and dangerous alliance, appealing to the ambition of King Edward's own volatile and jealous brother, George, Duke of Clarence, who felt he, too, had been sidelined by the Woodvilles. In 1469, this alliance struck. Warwick launched a sudden, clinical rebellion, outmaneuvering the royal forces, and in a stunning turn of events, captured the seemingly invincible King Edward IV, holding the anointed King of England as his own prisoner. Warwick's victory was not just political, it was brutally personal. With the king in chains, Warwick's vengeance turned directly toward the Queen's family, the source of his humiliation. He hunted down Elizabeth's father, Earl Rivers, and her scandalously married brother, John Woodville. Following a sham trial, both were summarily executed. In one swift, bloody stroke, the patriarch and a key member of the Woodville clan were eliminated, and the Queen's seemingly unassailable family structure was shattered. The situation grew even more desperate. How does a queen, now the wife of a captive king, stripped of her protectors and herself hunted by rebels, find the strength to act? Her vulnerability was acute. She was 9 months pregnant, responsible not only for her own life, but for the lives of her young daughters, and most importantly, for the future of the Yorkist dynasty. Her entire focus shifted to one goal: saving the potential heir to the throne. Warwick's control over Edward proved untenable, and the king escaped, but the kingmaker was relentless. In 1470, Warwick shocked England by invading again, this time allied with his former mortal enemies, the Lancastrians. He successfully restored the frail, mentally unstable Henry VI to the throne. This time, Edward IV's luck ran out. His support collapsed, and he was forced to abandon his kingdom and flee into exile across the sea to Burgundy, leaving his queen and children behind. Elizabeth was now completely abandoned in a hostile London ruled by her Lancastrian enemies. With Warwick's forces closing in, the pregnant queen made a desperate move. She gathered her young children, including her daughters, and fled in the dead of night to the imposing Westminster Abbey. There, she formally claimed the ancient right of sanctuary, a sacred protection that by church law made her and her children inviolable. The laws of sanctuary were absolute. No soldier or agent of the king could forcibly enter and arrest them on holy ground. The legal protection, however, did not provide for comfort. In a cold, stark room within the abbey's precincts, surrounded on all sides by a city now controlled by her mortal enemies, Elizabeth Woodville endured her confinement and gave birth to her first son, the boy who represented the future of their cause, the future and tragic King Edward V. The Yorkist cause seemed utterly lost. Edward IV was an exiled king residing on the charity of his brother-in-law in Burgundy, possessing no army and no treasury. His kingdom was gone, his wife and children were fugitives, and his son had been born in a sanctuary. The question looming over all of Europe was whether it was even possible for him to reclaim his throne, or if this would require one single, impossibly desperate military campaign. Against all odds, in March 1471, Edward IV returned. He landed at Ravenspur with a laughably small force, initially claiming he only sought the return of his dukedom of York. But this was a ruse. As he marched across England, his legendary charisma, his military reputation, and the sheer force of his will acted as a magnet, gathering disillusioned supporters and swelling the ranks of his small army for a final confrontation. The first decisive clash came at the Battle of Barnet. In the dense, disorienting fog of early morning, Edward's forces met the army of the kingmaker. The battle was a brutal, confused melee where visibility was almost zero. In a fatal error, the thick fog caused Warwick's own men to mistake their allies' banner for the enemy's, leading them to attack each other. In the ensuing chaos, Edward's army triumphed, and Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, was cut down and killed as he tried to flee. Edward gave his enemies no time to recover. Just weeks later, he intercepted the final remaining Lancastrian army at the Battle of Tewkesbury. The battle was a complete and utter rout for the Yorkists. The Lancastrian heir, Edward of Westminster, was killed in the battle's aftermath, extinguishing the direct line. Days later, the puppet king Henry VI, now useless as a figurehead, was quietly murdered in the Tower of London, securing Edward's throne. With her enemies dead and her husband's crown secure, Elizabeth Woodville walked out of the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey, clutching her infant son, the new Prince of Wales. She was no longer a fugitive, but a triumphant queen, her husband a conquering king once more. The decade that followed this restoration, from 1471 to 1483, represented the absolute zenith of Woodville power, a golden age for her family's influence and wealth. Elizabeth had learned, however, that a queen's greatest enemies are not always the ones raising banners on a battlefield. Those are, at least, clearly identifiable. Often, the more insidious rivals, the ones who harbor deep-seated resentments and bide their time, are the ones standing beside you in the same throne room, smiling at the same court functions. Her most obvious rival, the defeated Lancastrian Queen Margaret of Anjou, was now a non-entity. Captured after Tewkesbury, the indomitable she-wolf of France, who had prosecuted the war against the Yorkists for years, was now Elizabeth's prisoner, her spirit broken, her son dead. The wolf was, at long last, caged, soon to be ransomed back to France, never to return. A far more complex and persistent rival was her own mother-in-law, the formidable matriarch of the House of York, Cecily Neville. Known as Proud Cis, this deeply pious and aristocratic woman never forgave her son, King Edward, for what she considered his disastrously unsuitable marriage. She looked upon Elizabeth as a low-born widow who had bewitched her son, a stain on the royal dignity she held so dear. And then, moving quietly in the shadows of the court, was another woman, perhaps the most underestimated of all, Margaret Beaufort. A figure of intense, almost fanatical piety and steely patience, Margaret had navigated the treacherous political landscape for years with a singular, unyielding objective: to protect her exiled son, Henry Tudor, the distant and tenuous Lancastrian claimant, and one day, by any means necessary, to see him take the throne. The stability of Edward's reign, and by extension the Woodvilles' power, rested almost entirely on one man's vitality. What is a kingdom that is built not on institutions, but on the personal strength, charisma, and martial prowess of a single man? It is, ultimately, a house of cards, seemingly strong and impressive, but precariously balanced and ready to collapse into utter chaos the very moment that one man, the central pillar, falls. That moment arrived with shocking suddenness in April 1483. King Edward IV, at the absolute height of his power, robust, handsome, and seemingly invincible, returned from a fishing trip complaining of a chill. He suddenly fell gravely ill. His illness, likely pneumonia or typhoid, progressed with terrifying speed, and just days later the mighty King Edward IV was dead, aged only 40. In the instant Edward drew his last breath, Elizabeth Woodville's entire world shattered. She was instantly and irrevocably transformed from the secure and powerful Queen of England, wife of the king, to a vulnerable Queen Dowager. Her power had derived entirely from her husband. Now, that protection was gone, and she was left to navigate a court full of her old enemies. The new king, her son Edward V, was a boy of only 12 years old. Crucially, he was not in London. He was hundreds of miles away at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border, where he was being raised under the care and complete control of her trusted brother, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. The race to secure the person of the new king and thus control the kingdom had begun. According to Edward IV's will, the realm was not to be ruled by the Queen, but was placed into the hands of a Lord Protector who would govern until the young king came of age. That man was the king's younger brother, a man famed for his loyalty and military skill, Elizabeth's brother-in-law, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. This set in motion one of the most infamous power grabs in history. How does one go about stealing a crown from a rightful, albeit young king? The strategy, as it unfolded, was chillingly simple. First, you assert your legal right to protect the king. Then, under the guise of that protection, you systematically and ruthlessly eliminate his true protectors. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, understood the urgency and moved with lightning speed. As the young King Edward IV's entourage, led by Anthony Woodville, traveled from Ludlow toward London for the coronation, Richard rode out and intercepted their party at Stony Stratford. He arrived not as an enemy, but as a grieving uncle paying his respects. The pretense of loyalty quickly evaporated. In a sudden, decisive coup, Richard arrested Elizabeth's brother, Anthony Woodville, and her son from her first marriage, Sir Richard Grey, accusing them of high treason and of plotting to usurp his authority as protector. With the Queen's family neutralized, the terrified 12-year-old king was now, for all intents and purposes, the prisoner of his uncle Richard. When the devastating news reached Elizabeth in London that her brother and son had been arrested and her kingly son was in Gloucester's custody, she was consumed by a chilling, familiar terror. Knowing exactly what this meant, she wasted no time. For the second time in her life, she fled, taking her remaining children, including her younger son Richard, Duke of York, and her daughters, back into the cold, stone security of sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. Richard of Gloucester, now in complete control, escorted the young King Edward V to London. He did not, however, install him in the royal palace. Instead, he lodged the boy in the Tower of London, which was both a royal residence and the most secure fortress in the kingdom. The official reason was for the king's safety and protection in the run-up to his now postponed coronation. This move set the stage for the darkest mystery of the era, a question that historians still debate 5 centuries later. How is it possible for 2 royal princes, the most important children in the kingdom, to vanish from the most secure fortress in all of England? How could they disappear from within the stone walls of the Tower of London, seemingly without a single witness or a single trace? To complete his plan, Richard needed the second son, the spare heir. He dispatched the Archbishop of Canterbury to the sanctuary, arguing that the young king was lonely in the tower and required the companionship of his 9-year-old brother, Richard, Duke of York. Under immense pressure and facing threats that sanctuary would be violated, a distraught Elizabeth was forced to release her younger son into the Archbishop's custody. The young Duke of York was delivered from the sanctuary and immediately taken to join his elder brother in the Tower of London. With both Yorkist heirs now securely in his possession, Richard made his final move. He pressured Parliament to pass an act, Titulus Regius, which declared that King Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid from the start, based on a flimsy claim of a pre-contract. In an instant, both boys in the Tower were declared illegitimate. With his nephews officially declared bastards and thus ineligible for the throne, the line of succession now pointed directly to him. The charade of protection was over. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, accepted the petition of the 3 estates of the realm and, in a lavish ceremony, was crowned King Richard III, usurping the throne of his own brother's son. For a short time after their uncle's coronation, the 2 young princes, now bastardized and imprisoned, were occasionally seen playing in the Tower gardens. But as the summer of 1483 wore on, these sightings became less frequent. And then they stopped entirely. The boys were never seen again by any credible witness. They simply vanished from history, their fates sealed within the Tower's walls, presumed murdered on their uncle's orders. Elizabeth's situation was now beyond desperate. How does a woman no longer a queen, but a grieving mother, stripped of her royal title, her lands confiscated, and her sons presumed murdered, find a way to fight back? How can she possibly challenge a sitting king, a ruthless usurper who has launched a powerful propaganda campaign branding her a sorceress and a witch? To justify his usurpation, King Richard III's propaganda machine went into overdrive. He needed to destroy Elizabeth's reputation completely. He revived and amplified old rumors, publicly accusing her and her mother, Jacquetta, of witchcraft. The official narrative became that she had never truly been Edward's wife, but had illegitimately entrapped him into marriage through the dark arts of sorcery. The legal assault was as brutal as the propaganda. Her marriage was formally nullified by Parliament, stripping her of all titles and lands. She was no longer Queen Elizabeth, but demoted to her previous pre-royal status, Dame Elizabeth Grey. To complete his bloody consolidation of power, Richard III ordered the execution of her captive brother, Anthony Woodville, and her son, Sir Richard Grey. Elizabeth was now trapped in sanctuary for a third time, a broken woman. She was grieving the public execution of her brother and son, and suffering the private, unimaginable agony of not knowing the fate of her two vanished princes. To Richard III and the rest of the world, she was finally completely powerless, or so it seemed. This moment of total despair sparked the most unlikely alliance of the entire war. What happens when two formidable mothers, two women who have been rivals their entire lives, suddenly find themselves facing a common enemy? What do they do when that one man threatens the lives and futures of both their children? They put aside their lifelong animosity and they unite. Even with her sons gone, Elizabeth Woodville still held one final crucial card to play. This card was her eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. With her brothers presumed dead, this young woman was now, in the eyes of all Yorkists who despised Richard III, the single true legitimate heir to the throne. From within the confines of Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth Woodville, the Yorkist queen, began a clandestine correspondence. She secretly contacted, through trusted physicians, her old court rival, the Lancastrian matriarch, Margaret Beaufort. Margaret's son, Henry Tudor, was the sole remaining Lancastrian claimant, living in exile in France and hunted by Richard's spies. The plan they hatched was a stroke of political genius, an ultimate enemy of my enemy pact. They would unite their two warring houses, the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York, against the usurper. Henry Tudor would gather an army and invade England. Upon defeating Richard III, he would claim the throne and, in a symbolic and binding act, he would marry Elizabeth of York, healing the deep wounds of the nation. This was the ultimate desperate gamble. Could a plot, hatched in secret by two women, one in sanctuary, the other under house arrest by two mothers operating through coded messages, actually succeed? Could this alliance of rivals finally bring an end to the 3 decades of bloody, chaotic, and ruinous civil war that had torn England apart? The plan was set in motion. On August 22, 1485, Henry Tudor, having landed in Wales, brought his small, largely mercenary army to face the much larger, battle-hardened royal forces of King Richard III at a place called Bosworth Field. This was not just another battle. It was the final, desperate roll of the dice for the Tudor-Woodville alliance. The battle raged, and for a time, it seemed Richard's superior numbers would win the day. The decisive moment came from the sidelines. Lord Stanley, Margaret Beaufort's powerful and strategically ambiguous husband, had been waiting with a third independent army. At the critical moment, seeing Richard III engaged, Stanley finally betrayed his king and ordered his forces to attack the royal flank, sealing Richard's fate. Unhorsed and surrounded, King Richard III refused to flee and was cut down, killed in the thick of the fighting. He became the last English king to ever die in combat. With his death, the battle was won, the Yorkist regime collapsed, and the decades-long War of the Roses was, at last, effectively over. The desperate secret gambit planned by the two mothers had worked. For Elizabeth Woodville, the victory was bittersweet. Her beloved sons, the princes in the Tower, were gone forever. Her husband, King Edward IV, was dead. Her family had been decimated. Yet, looking at the battlefield and the new political reality, a profound question emerges. Despite all her personal losses, did Elizabeth Woodville, the commoner queen, ultimately win the War of the Roses? Henry Tudor, as promised, claimed the crown by right of conquest and was anointed King Henry VII, the first of the Tudor dynasty. He immediately honored the pact that his mother had made. He brought Elizabeth of York to court and, in a hugely popular move, married her, physically and symbolically uniting the White Rose of York with his own Red Rose of Lancaster. From this union, the new dynastic symbol of a peaceful England, the Tudor Rose, was born. And Elizabeth Woodville, the woman who had begun her journey as a supplicant widow waiting under an oak tree, now held a new, respected title. She was the Queen Dowager, and more importantly, she was the Queen Mother, the mother of the new Queen of England. She lived her final years in quiet dignity, retiring to an abbey, but not before she witnessed the fulfillment of her life's work. She lived to see her daughter, Elizabeth of York, crowned queen. She lived to see the birth of her first grandson, Prince Arthur, the heir to the new dynasty, securing her family's legacy. Her bloodline, the commoner Woodville blood, was now royal, and it would rule England for the next 118 years. Her legacy was not just in that first grandson. Her other grandchildren, the most famous monarchs in English history, the formidable Henry VIII, the devout Mary I, and the indomitable Elizabeth I, were all her direct descendants. The woman they called a commoner, the widow who demanded a crown, had successfully channeled her bloodline through tragedy and war to define an entire dynasty.